that affected his theory. Often the truth of a doctrine or theory can be checked by the history of its origin. This is very true about Calvinism. Men can't change history. It is left exactly as it falls. Sculptures remain as they were when they were formed throughout their existence. No one can go back and correct or change anything in history. It is what it is. For that reason and others in this study we search the history of Calvinism to see from what and where it came. In this study we will see if it came from the apostles or not. In fact, history will not lie to us, it will tell us whether it is of God or not. The doctrine of total depravity is the foundation of Calvin's doctrines of grace. In this chapter, I present the history of Calvinism, in particular, the history of the total depravity theory. During the study, it will be important to notice that this dogma did not start with the apostles, nor was it known to the saints in the apostolic era. First, I discuss St. Augustine, from whence came Calvin's dogma. I share the origin of his beliefs and doctrine. Then later I discuss John Calvin and the Reformers and the role they played in propagating Calvinism. I discuss John Wesley and the Arminians, who taught free will opposed to Calvin's bondage of the will theory. This history is presented because it is necessary that we who are in the apostolic faith know what they taught in this dogma, so that we can evaluate the truth of the matter. At the end of the study, we will be able to articulate what the doctrine of total depravity is, where it came from, identify its sources, and explain what the Word of God says about it, from the perspective of the Apostles' faith. As we go through the study, it may be rather shocking to find out what was in Augustine's belief system that he poured into the concoction that made up this doctrine. Our retrospective view of the things that happened to form and propagate this theory are viewed with 2020's vision as we look back at history that will not lie to us or change while we analyze it. It is what it is. Manichaeism, the root of Augustinian Calvinism. The Gnostic element in Calvinism. As stated in the introduction of the series, it all started with Augustine, who was once a hearer of Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, a version of Gnostic dualism. Augustine was a Manichaean for 9 years. Manichaeism is rooted in a form of Gnosticism that taught its own form of election, total depravity, and the natural inability of man to do righteously. According to the non-apostolic ideas which were learned by Augustine in Manichaeism, man's will is in bondage. Later, for polemic reasons, when Augustine tried to fit this concept into a Christian context, he taught that the bondage of the will was passed on to the human race via sexual copulation, starting with Adam and Eve. He thought, just like to the Manichaeans, the will was in bondage in the natural evil of all matter idea dualism. All things physical are evil. Man is matter. Matter is evil. Man is evil. They taught the natural evil of all matter, including man. They taught man's will was in bondage to only do evil, because the will is overcome by the darkness of evil, in all things. They taught that bondage caused the natural inability of man to not sin. Such was innate in mankind. Throughout this series it is explained how these ideas which were taught in Manichaeism are taught in Augustine's and Calvin's theories, hence the inability of man due to man's will being in bondage to evil and being totally depraved. This concept is shared in form in Neoplatonism, fatalism, predeterminism, docetism, dualism, and other pagan and Gnostic beliefs, as it is explained how in this series. This dangerous and unbiblical concept is the root of Augustine's original sin doctrine, which is also the core basis of the 5 points of Calvinism tulip. In this series on Calvinism, it is shown how each point of Calvinism is sprung from this basic Gnostic concept. Each point builds on this theory. Each of the points of Calvinism are Augustine's philosophical explanations of how salvation works in the context of Augustine's predestination theory. Each one of the points of tulip, in their order, is the foundation for the next point of the theory. And all of the points are based on the Gnostic concept of the bondage of the will, which was inherited by Augustine from Manichaeism and illegitimately mixed with the biblical account of the fall of Adam. This Gnostic mixture produced his original sin theory, the theory upon which the whole of Calvinism is built. Augustine had to find a way to believe in the evil of matter, as the Gnostics taught, and still be Christian in his theology. Thus, he theologically rationalized and compromised the biblical account of the fall of man, misusing it to claim it as the point where man became as evil and bound in his will, as the Gnostics taught. Consequently, sadly, and deceitfully, Augustine, by some force in him, made up his unapostolic, unchristian original sin doctrine, by mixing Gnosticism with the biblical account of the fall of man. Thus, according to Augustine's theory, not the apostles or Jesus Adam's original sin resulted in the idea of man being totally depraved. From that we get point 1 of his doctrine tulip, the doctrine of total depravity, which is the basis and or reason for point 2 of the theory, the doctrine of unconditional election. Then based on that, he philosophically proposes point 3, the limited atonement theory. Then based on the limited atonement theory, point 4, the doctrine of irresistible grace was made. Then finally, the doctrine of unconditional eternal security, which is based on all of the other 4 previous points. This is the order and the thinking of tulip. It must be noted that in order for any one of the points to be true, the previous points that proceeded must be true. And for all of it to be true, the original sin theory must be true, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Manichaeism, also as Calvinism eventually did, separated out the members between the elect and the hearers. The elect, being those who were so blessed as to come to perfection, and the hearers, were the servants of the elect, here on earth. In Augustine's writings, in his Confessions, he expresses and admits to his own personal moral conflict and seemingly bondage to sin and corruption. Thus, he erroneously used himself as an example of the corruption that he claimed from his roots in Manichaeism, was innate in all men. This bondage of the will concept was later explained by him as being the bondage of the will which he taught, in his Gnostic-influenced, original sin theory, Augustine's doctrine of original sin. Origin of the bondage of the will doctrine. Eventually, after being indoctrinated by Manichaeism's bondage of the will teaching, for some reason, Augustine broke with Manichaeism in about AD 387, when he joined the church. It was then when he used his debating skills to dispute the Manichaeans against their doctrine of the bondage of the will and the natural inability of man. They were teaching that the will was enslaved to evil in man, and therefore it was totally unable to overcome the darkness of evil. Hence, Manichaeism taught against the freedom of the will, like it was later taught by the Calvinist. The Church historically believed in practical holiness. It is very interesting and most worthy of note here, that before Augustine joined the Church, in the days of the early Church, the debate over the freedom of man's will versus the total depravity of man's will, that is, the bondage of the will, was one of the major divisions between the early Christians and the Gnostic sects that taught this basic version of a total depravity doctrine. The Manichaeans and other Gnostics denied free will. The Church Fathers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, who were far nearer to the true gospel teachings of the apostles' times than those later Church Fathers in the 4th century were. Thus, the earlier Church Fathers fought the bondage of the will dogma. The 1st and 2nd century Fathers believed, and maintained, against the Manichaeans, and taught that whatever state man is in, he has the freedom of his own will over his own actions. They taught that man has the same power to do good or evil. Because of this doctrinal conflict, the early Church Fathers and the Manichaeans were polemic rivals. The Manichaeans so denied free will, as to hold that man had a bondage to sin as a fatal necessity of sinning. In their Gnostic thinking, man can't do anything but evil. No matter what man does, it is evil in nature. It is from this point in Manichaeism where Augustine made the statement, man cannot not sin. It is also from there that modern Presbyterians and other Protestants get the teaching that saints can't live holy, making statements in their sermons like, we sin every day, man is prone to sin as the sparks do upward fly, no one is perfect. And other statements that say that man is bound to sin no matter what, even if he gets saved. This is what is put in the mind of people who claim to be Christians, almost licensing them to live immorally if they choose to. Why was the inability to live right a main teaching of Calvinism? This concept is ornate in Calvinism's total depravity theory. Before Augustine, the free will and natural ability of man to choose righteousness, and not to sin, were held commonly and firmly by the Church. However, contrary to the Church Fathers' teachings on the freedom of the will, there was the teaching among the Gnostics which had leaked into the Church of the natural inability of man. This unbiblical teaching was before Augustine only held by the pagan philosophers and the Gnostics and a few Gnostic-infected philosophers and theologians, like the Manichaeans. This teaching was of the secular world of philosophy, paganism, fatalism, and Neoplatonism. It only got past the Church Fathers and into the church world, after the more pure Church Fathers of the 1st and 2nd centuries had died off. It was brought into the Church, being carried in St. Augustine's baggage of secular philosophical ideologies, when he introduced it in the 4th century about AD 397. As we can see from its history, it was a mere orthodox excuse for the ungodliness of those who were in the Church's system. Doctrine of original sin theory started as situational theology.